Doubled pawns are the most misunderstood pawn structure in chess. After this video, you will know when they are good, when they create weaknesses, and how you can use them to their fullest potential in your games. First things first, let's take a look at this position. After queen takes on b6, we have an option. We can take with the knight or we can take with the pawn. Believe it or not, taking with the knight is not as good as taking with the pawn for two main reasons. Reason number one is that this exchange opens up the rook on the A file. And the reason number two is that in the future, we can use this pawn to attack our opponent or to control some very key squares. So for example, let's say we play this move pawn to b5. Now our goal here is to play b4 and dispatch the knight from c3. This is a very active square. We want to get rid of that knight. White stops us, but now look at this. With the pawn being on b5, we have a very nice clamp on this c4 square, and now we can go knight to b6. We can go h6 first. We can throw this move in. Bishop will move back, and now we go knight to b6 with the idea of jumping the knight to c4. Now, I'm also going to show you a sequence of moves here. You don't have to remember all of this, but there's another idea behind this sort of a doubled pawn, which started on a7, it went to b6, b5, and then it went to c4. Positionally, this pawn being on c4 is very useful because it sort of controls the mobility of the pawn on b2, and we can take advantage of this within the next couple of moves. It doesn't have to be immediate here. I'm just going to skip forward, but eventually black will push b5 and black will push b4. And once this happens, as you can see, the pawn on a3 is under tremendous amounts of pressure. So a takes b4 has to be played in order to not lose the pawn on a3. And after bishop takes b4, this pawn right here is sort of isolated here on b2. And now we can attack it with moves like rook to a2. In the future, if we are able to get rid of this bishop, we can even go rook to b8. And there are weaknesses for white. This position isn't immediately winning for black, but there are major weaknesses that black can exploit. And all of this happened because we took on b6 with the pawn, opened up our rook, and we actually used our doubled pawn, which traditionally is a weakness, but we used it to our advantage to control our opponent's structure. So in scenarios like this, doubled pawns are actually very, very useful. When you're the side with the doubled pawns, you want to make sure everything is together and compact. You do not want to push any unnecessary pawns, and you do not want to leave any weaknesses behind. So what do I mean by that? Now, obviously, if we take on e5, I think most of you can tell that after d takes e5, these are double isolated pawns, and we're going to talk more about them very soon. But this is a terrible pawn structure for the white pieces. But going back, what most of you might not have noticed is if you push the pawn to d5, this is also a very bad move because this creates a weakness on c5. So you're pushing the pawn to d5, and earlier in the game these pawns were doubled, so there's no more b pawn, so nobody's left to control the c5 square, so the knight can hop to c5 whenever it wants to. More than that, black can actually play this move e4, and if you take, then black plays knight to c5, and look at this absolutely terrible pawn structure. All of the pawns over here are backwards pawns, and they are all targets. If knight to g3 is played, you can even take the knight, and this pawn structure is really, really bad. So this is not something you want to do. Instead, you want to keep everything compact. You want to keep the tension. You can do multiple different things in this position. You can play knight g3. You can even play e4 to take the full center, but you do not want to push d5 because this gives up the square on c5. You want to maintain as much control as possible, and be careful when you're pushing pawns next to your doubled pawns, because for example this d pawn next to the doubled c pawns is very important. Let's say black plays rook e8. If you push the d pawn, you are leaving this square to be up for grabs for black, so you have to be very careful. Try to keep the pawns together and compact, and try to maintain control. I often hear beginners and intermediate players play moves like bishop to g3 in this position, and they say that, oh, this is a good exchange because it damages white's structure. But to me, this is not really a damaged structure because it's three on 3 anyways. In any endgame, the pawns are going to get traded off, and you can't really take advantage of these doubled pawns in this position. So you have to realize the practical value of the doubled pawns, and you have to realize that in this case, if you take here, it doesn't really give you anything. These doubled pawns, to me, the way I look at them, they're kind of neutral, right? They're not necessarily overly beneficial for white, but it's not like you can take advantage of them with black either. So this exchange doesn't really give you all that much for the black pieces. Now, instead of that, a strategically better move in this position would be something like bishop to e7, keeping the bishops on the board. Why? Because look at the pawns. White's pawns are on dark squares, black's pawns are on light squares. That means in any endgame, black will be able to target these pawns, while white's bishop, dark square bishop, will not be able to target black's pawns. So actually, this bishop right here is superior to the bishop on g3. Very slightly, it's not winning or anything just yet, but that's how winning positions start. You start with a very small, minuscule advantage, and you slowly try to build upon that. And making these sort of unnecessary exchanges just to say that you doubled somebody's pawns, this is fine for white. It doesn't really damage white's pawn structure, and it doesn't help you that much for the black side. Now, the worst type of doubled pawns are double isolated pawns, and the reason why double isolated pawns are bad is because they leave weaknesses behind. Remember this core principle: the squares in front of double isolated pawns are often very, very weak, and we can see how white can take advantage of them by playing knight to e2 and then knight to f4. Now, this square is an outpost for this knight. It's actually a classic good knight versus a bad bishop situation because it's a dark square outpost. This is a light square bishop. That means the bishop will never be able to challenge this knight. And we see the problem of having double isolated pawns. You don't have g pawns and you don't have e pawns either to contest this square on f4. And because of that, white is able to plant this knight on f4, and soon white will simply castle, and you can try to go for some sort of an attack here, maybe on the queen side or even somehow on the king side, but none of that's really going to work. You have to remember that the squares in front of them are very, very weak. If you're playing this position from the white side, try to take advantage of that, and if you're playing from the black side, try to defend against that as much as possible. Now, sometimes your opponent will take you on squares like b6, they will trade the bishops off, and you're gonna have to make a decision. Do you take with the a pawn or do you take with the c pawn? In the majority of cases, it's going to be better to take towards the center of the board. In this case, this also opens up the rook on the a file. This is something we already talked about earlier, but you do not want to be making moves like c takes b6 because that splits the pawns apart. That's not very compact. That's actually the opposite. You're splitting the pawns, and you're also leaving these slight weaknesses on d6. So the way white would take advantage of them, for example, is white will go rook e1 and then knight to d2. And if you make this exchange, now the knight is on c4 and this pawn is going to be under pressure for a very long time. Now, again, this position isn't immediately winning for white or anything like that, but the problem is that whenever you make moves like c takes b6, you have to remember you're allowing your opponent to put pressure on you, but instead of taking with the c pawn, if you take with the a pawn, now you're the one that's putting a bit more pressure on your opponent. And to a lot of you, this might not matter at all, but the thing is that even these small evaluations, like these minus 0.2 evaluations, over time, it really adds up. So if you're able to get these small positional advantages throughout the game, if you accumulate them, then we're going to talk about a seriously strong and even a winning position. And unfortunately here, c takes b6 doesn't accomplish that for black. It accomplishes that for white by splitting the pawns and giving white targets. Sometimes doubled pawns can be very useful when it comes to controlling the center. So for example, one of the ideas in these types of positions for black is to play knight to h5 and exchange the knight for the bishop on f4. However, in this case, that's actually quite beneficial for white. You can completely allow that, and it's not like you can stop it, to be fair. But the thing is, you can just castle, you can allow your opponent to take on f4, and then you take back, And now if we take a look at this position, the main pawn break in these types of positions for black is this move pawn to e5. But the thing is that after this exchange right here, they cannot play pawn to e5 anymore. It's significantly more difficult to execute pawn to e5. You also have a semi-open e-file to work with, and you have a very strong grip on the e5 square. Now, the only downside to e takes f4 is that this pawn can be a bit loose in some positions, but that doesn't matter because you're just going to protect it, right? You're not just going to blunder the pawn. And as long as you don't blunder this pawn, the doubled pawns here, the doubled f pawn on f4 is actually very, very useful when it comes to controlling e5, which is black's main pawn break. And we know in chess we need to get pawn breaks in order to activate our pieces. So if we are able to control e5 very well with the pawn on f4, then black will never play e5, and that means black will struggle to activate his rooks. So that is the positional advantage of having this pawn on f4. It's not a bad pawn just because it's a doubled pawn. It's actually very, very useful when it comes to controlling the center. Now, if you want to learn more about pawn breaks, click the video that's on the screen right now. That will teach you how you should be performing these sorts of pawn breaks in order to fully activate all of your pieces.